the late Marilyn Monroe.
It's really getting the truest part of yourself out, and it's very hard, you know.
June 1st, 1926, an icon is born. But before she was an icon, she was an orphan. This is technically not true. Norma Jean Mortensen had 2 living parents. Her father, Charles Stanley Gifford, refused to acknowledge her, and her mother, Gladys Baker, was unable to take care of her. And so at the age of 9, Marilyn Monroe was dropped off at the Los Angeles orphanage, screaming the whole time that she was not an orphan. She had parents. Norma Jean was born to Gladys and Charles in June of 1926. More accurately, she was born to Gladys, as Charles had already skipped out on them both. At the time, Gladys was both rather poor and not functioning well mentally or emotionally. When Norma Jean was only a few weeks old, her grandmother Della approached Ida Bolander to take in the little baby. Della was fast and fun and known to haunt the speakeasies. She'd met Ida at a church swap meet and continued to buy old clothes from her. She knew Ida took in foster children and begged her to take Norma Jean. Ida did. This was the first of many foster homes that Norma Jean would live in. In her own words, she became, quote, something of a child slave, doing dishes and laundry and waiting on her foster families. Before she married at the age of 16, Norma Jean would have 9 sets of foster parents. She was briefly united with her mother around the age of 7. She went to live with Gladys and her friend Grace. Gladys and Grace both worked as film cutters. Not long after, Gladys had a psychotic episode that was witnessed by Marilyn. Gladys was diagnosed a paranoid schizophrenic and was institutionalized where she would remain, for the most part, until she died. Aunt Grace, despite the pleas of her friends because the child might be, quote-unquote, wrong, like her mother, decided to adopt Marilyn. This worked out well. Although there was never any money, Grace and Norma adored each other. Grace was obsessed with Jean Harlow, and soon so was Norma. Grace would tell her adopted daughter that someday she would be as famous as Jean Harlow. But the little family was not going to last. Grace married, and her new husband was not very fond of Marilyn. Marilyn later described him as creepy. Doc Goddard demanded Grace get rid of Norma Jean, which she did. Norma Jean was sent to live with Grace's aunt, Aunt Anna. Sadly, this didn't last either. Marilyn described her childhood as lonely. Many of her foster families treated her terribly. She was last in line for everything. The students in school made fun of her because of her poverty. She had only 2 outfits to wear, both identical, a blue skirt and white blouse issued by the orphanage. Norma bounced from house to house, to the orphanage and back again. She eventually found her way back to Aunt Grace and Doc Goddard. But they decided to move to Virginia, and Norma Jean was not welcome to come with them. That's when Aunt Grace hatched the plan to marry Norma off to Jimmy Doherty. A funny thing happened when Norma was around 12. She was always considered a pretty child even as a baby. Puberty and a size too small sweater was all it took to turn the tides for her in school. Suddenly, Norma Jean was popular. She leaned into her good looks and developed body. She started wearing makeup, and the size too small borrowed sweater became a wardrobe staple. Norma Jean went on a lot of dates. She enjoyed male attention, but she remained completely chaste. In fact, sex scared her more than anything. She was molested by a boarder in one of her foster homes, and this may have had something to do with her lack of interest in sex. Things didn't get any better when she married Jimmy. When Norma was 16, it was arranged that she would marry her neighbor and sometime date Jimmy Doherty. He was 5 years her senior. Aunt Grace figured it was better than sending Norma back to the orphanage she hated so much. Norma Jean was married in a small ceremony that her Aunt Grace did not even attend. She and Jimmy set up house. Norma was intent on being a good wife. She dropped out of school in her sophomore year, a decision she always regretted. Accounts of Norma Jean's first marriage vary. At the time, Jimmy told his friends she hated sex, would often lock herself in the bathroom, and had a parade of mysterious ailments that would render her unable to perform her wifely duties. Marilyn would later state of her first marriage that any interest she had in sex was completely gone once she got married. Later, however, once Norma became Marilyn, Jim Doherty's story changed. Norma Jean had been a nymphomaniac. She was a tigress in bed. She had to have it 5 times a day. The war came, and Jimmy joined the Merchant Marines. Marilyn went to work in a factory. Fate came knocking in the unlikely form of Ronald Reagan. Reagan was in charge of entertainment for the troops, and they wanted pictures of girls, Reagan decided. Go to some factories and take some pictures of pretty girls working hard for our boys back home, he said. Norma Jean was asked to pose. Even in her factory-issued garb, she made an impression. Soon she was modeling, and the factory job went the way of the dodo. She was making much more money modeling. Her in-laws didn't approve, and she moved out of their house. When Jimmy came home on leave, he was dismayed to see what his wife had been doing. She was so proud of herself. She'd saved her covers and photo spreads to show her husband. He hated it. "This modeling stops now," he ordered. Soon, his leave was over, and Norma Jean went about doing exactly as she wanted. She went back to modeling. Over the years, many photographers have claimed to have slept with her, but this simply wasn't the case. Norma Jean was incredibly popular and in high demand. She didn't need to sleep with anyone in order to get a job. Soon the war was over and Jimmy was back home for good. It was apparent to everyone but him that his marriage was also over. Perhaps if he could have supported his wife's career, things would have been different. But he couldn't. And she wasn't in love with him besides. When he came home, he ordered her to stop working and take care of him. "We're going to have a baby now, and you're going to stop working and be a wife and mother." In response, Norma Jean filed for divorce. Now she was 20 and on her own. She was poor, always borrowing money and waiting on jobs to pop up. Her modeling agent, Emmeline Snively, told her, "You need to go blonde." At first, she resisted, but eventually, the brunette Norma Jean bleached her hair blonde. The jobs picked up. She was also going on auditions at the movie studios with little success. Her hair was not the first change Norma Jean would make in the steps to become Marilyn Monroe. She also had her hairline changed and got a chin implant after she overheard an executive at a party calling her a chinless wonder. There is speculation that she had a nose job, but this has never been confirmed. Norma Jean began to haunt Hollywood studios and parties. She wanted in. In her autobiography, she describes going to parties and standing in the corner, not knowing a soul and afraid to talk to anyone. It was important to be seen, though, to stand out. So she would often arrive late in a low-cut dress that showed off her figure. She hoped she gave off a mysterious air rather than a shy and secure one. Once again, despite numerous stories, Norma Jean did not sleep around with Hollywood executives, agents, or producers. She dated 2 power players, William Morris agent Johnny Hyde and Joe Schenck, chairman of 20th Century Fox. She slept with Joe once, but they became friends after that, and by her own account, he often invited her to his industry dinner parties to, quote, dress up the table. Johnny Hyde fell in love with her. He left his wife and children for her. In ill health, he routinely asked her to marry him until his last days. She refused, stating, "Johnny, I'm just not in love with you. I can't marry you." She was devastated she could not love Johnny the way that he loved her, and she was devastated by his death. Norma Jean spent all her money on acting, singing, and dancing lessons. She began working with acting coach Natasha Lytess. Lytess fell in love with Norma Jean and began to pressure her to get romantically involved. Despite numerous refusals, Natasha kept pressuring her, and despite this behavior, Norma Jean continued to work with her. Indeed, many believe it is Natasha Lytess who was responsible for Marilyn's trademark breathy voice and childlike line delivery. By the early 1950s, the transformation was complete. Norma Jean was now Marilyn Monroe. The name change, by the way, was a suggestion by Ben Lyon, a 20th Century Fox executive. Monroe was her grandmother's maiden name. Marilyn had a few blink-and-you'll-miss-it parts in some movies, but nothing stuck. The bit part she had in a Marx Brothers movie brought her quite a bit of attention, and from then on, things were trending upward. Her role in The Asphalt Jungle, directed by John Huston, got her even more attention. 1952 changed everything. People were taking notice. She began to get bigger parts. Then the news of the nude photos came out. In the 50s, this should have been a career ruiner. Instead, it catapulted her to fame. "I was broke. I needed the money," she simply stated, and the public loved her for it. Her star was brighter than ever. She landed starring roles in Niagara, Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, and How to Marry a Millionaire. She also started dating the Yankee Clipper, Joe DiMaggio. Marilyn's marriage to Joe was brief. According to her, he beat her up twice. The first time was prior to filming The 7-Year Itch, and she told him, "Don't do it again." Joe's jealousy was overwhelming and abusive. He tried to police her clothing, specifically how low her necklines went, and her public image. He routinely told her to quit acting so she could become a housewife. Their fights were loud and frequent. When her friend Amy Green asked Marilyn why she married Joe, she quipped, "He's good in bed." The night of the infamous publicity stunt for The 7-Year Itch, 5,000 people gathered in the New York streets at 1 a.m. to watch the star have her dress blown up over and over again. She wore 2 pairs of underwear, but that was no match for the Klieg lights, and according to witnesses, you could see everything. Marilyn was unaware of this. Her husband was watching the scene and became so irate and disgusted he left. When she got back to their hotel room, he beat her up. She told him, "That's it," and she filed for divorce in 1954. Following the breakup, she briefly had an affair with good friend Frank Sinatra, who had also just had a breakup, but neither was really interested in anything romantic. Marilyn moved to New York, determined to become a better actress. She stopped seeing Natasha Lytess, who by this point had ingrained herself so deeply in the insecure star's working and personal life. She must have thought herself irreplaceable. Directors disliked Lytess, and more than once she was removed from the set. Marilyn's dependence on her was a crutch, and likely one that was not needed. After each take, it was Lytess Marilyn would look at to see if it was a good take, not the director. Marilyn left Lytess, who did not go gently into that good night, and began taking classes with Lee Strasberg at the prestigious Actors Studio in New York. In time, Lee's wife Paula would replace Lytess as an ever-present nuisance on Marilyn's sets. Lee believed Marilyn to possess a great talent, but he was hard on her, many students would recall. He was mean to her, one student said. Lee told Marilyn to draw on her pain and past experiences to act. He encouraged her to go to therapy. This began a rocky road. But Marilyn was determined to start anew. She started her own production company with friend and photographer Milton Green. This was unheard of at the time. Darryl Zanuck hated Marilyn, and he had from the jump. He thought not only did she not have talent, she was actually fired from Fox early on for being, quote, unphotogenic. She wasn't being given the meaty parts she wanted. Fox wanted to keep her in the money-making, sexy, dumb blonde roles. Marilyn wanted more. Her company produced Bus Stop and The Prince and the Showgirl. She met Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright Arthur Miller in 1951. The two began a romantic relationship in 1955. Miller was still married. It was a mismatch from the start, with Miller proving to be emotionally abusive. He criticized her constantly and called her a spoiled brat. He routinely told her he was embarrassed by her. Miller announced their marriage to the press before he had even asked Marilyn to marry him. In a shocking press conference regarding HUAC, Miller suddenly stated that he wanted to go to England to, quote, be with the woman who will soon be my wife. This was news to Marilyn. However, she rallied and held her own press conference the next day confirming the engagements. Various reports state she did not want to marry Miller, but felt she had to after the press buildup, and somewhere inside, she hoped maybe this one would work. While in England filming The Prince and the Showgirl, Marilyn found Miller's journal laying out on the table, for anyone to see, open to a page where he viciously maligned her. She became distraught. In the journal, he stated that she was a bitch, a, quote, dependable, pitiable waif, and that he did not love her. He wrote he was sorry he had married her. Miller was also quite jealous. He cut Marilyn off from Milton Green and the Green family and reportedly hated the Strasbergs as well. He would berate his wife for showing up late to set and not knowing her lines. It was during this time period Marilyn's drug use became dangerous. It is obvious Miller left this journal out for her to see, and yet the marriage persisted. Marilyn became pregnant soon after this discovery. However unsure she was about the father, she definitely wanted a child. But the pregnancy was ectopic. Amazingly, the Millers stayed married, and Marilyn became pregnant again on the set of Some Like It Hot in 1959. She miscarried. On her next film, Let's Make Love, Marilyn had an affair with her co-star Yves Montand. It became public knowledge, and the press conference Yves held with his wife blamed Marilyn for taking things too seriously and was a huge source of embarrassment for her. The marriage all but over, the Millers went to the Nevada desert to film Marilyn's last completed film, The Misfits, also directed by John Huston, a film Arthur Miller had written as a vehicle for his wife. It was also a vehicle for more abuse. She hated the character she played. Miller lifted lines from things they had actually said to each other in private moments and put them in the film. It was on the set of this film that Arthur Miller met his third wife, Inga. Though he claims there was no affair on set, one has to speculate. Once filming wrapped, Marilyn filed for divorce. Marilyn started taking pills to sleep around her early 20s. These were over-the-counter and not uncommon. She had always suffered from insomnia. As her fame rose, so did the pressure, and as the pressure became greater, she needed stronger drugs to fall asleep. The drugs became so strong, then she needed something to help her wake up. It was the Judy Garland special. 20th Century Fox doctors would routinely prescribe her a variety of drugs, whatever they felt she needed to complete the picture. She'd started psychoanalysis at the urging of Lee Strasberg, and this seemed to open a can of worms. What was once described as a lively, happy, fun young woman became a neurotic, depressed woman with terrible mood swings. Those closest to her thought the therapy was extremely detrimental. Marilyn was concerned she harbored the same mental illness her mother and grandmother had, and she was determined not to end up like them. She believed the therapy would keep her out of danger. She described herself as extremely sensitive, and even John Huston would say, it never seemed like she was acting, but that she was truly feeling the feelings. Everything on set was real to her. Perhaps she was too sensitive for heavy analysis. 5 days a week, dredging up her traumatic past, ad nauseum. She began seeing Mary Ann Criss on the East Coast and Dr. Ralph Greenson when she moved back to the West Coast. People noticed she was changing. Doctors began prescribing more barbiturates and now anti-anxiety drugs. She was even given the antipsychotic drug Thorazine. According to Natasha Lytess, Marilyn had overdosed more than once. Marilyn once wrote, quote, I was the kind of girl they found dead in a hall bedroom with an empty bottle of sleeping pills in her hand. As 1961 bore on, Marilyn was in a deep depression. She spoke of suicide. Her psychiatrist, Mary Ann Criss, told Marilyn what she needed was a break. She was burnt out, on the verge of a breakdown. She described the hospital as a place to rest and recharge. What she really did was commit Marilyn against her will and without her knowledge to a high-security mental institution. Being locked in Payne Whitney was a traumatic experience for Marilyn, who was forcibly stripped and locked in a padded cell. When she protested, screaming and crying to be let out, that this was all a mistake, the staff threatened to put her in a straitjacket. They refused to let her out. They refused to let her make a phone call. She managed to smuggle a note out to the Strasbergs, who did not answer. She then managed to get a call out to Joe DiMaggio, who was at spring training in Florida. He immediately got on the next plane and showed up that very night demanding his ex-wife's release. At Payne Whitney, he told them, quote, I don't care who does it, but if someone doesn't get her released from this place, I swear to Christ, I will take this hospital apart brick by brick. Marilyn was released and spent 3 weeks in a regular hospital resting and detoxing. Marilyn moved back to the West Coast and purchased her first home on 5th Helena Drive in Los Angeles. She seemed better. She renewed a friendship with DiMaggio, who told her, I would have divorced me too. She began treatment with Ralph Greenson, another man who also overstepped his boundaries with Marilyn. He had her living in his home, interacting with his family. Indeed, she was treated as part of the family. It wasn't simply unorthodox, it was criminal. When he left to go on a lecture tour, he left Marilyn with a bottle of pills, stating that she was to feel as though she were ingesting a piece of him when she took the pills, and that would make her feel better and feel as though he were there with her. She became utterly dependent on him. Greenson exerted control. He began to tell her who she should have in her life and who she shouldn't. She kicked longtime friends and employees out of her life on his orders. He installed a spy in her house. Her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, worked for Greenson. She was to report back to Greenson everything Marilyn did. When Marilyn died, the first person Eunice Murray called was Ralph Greenson. It is also interesting to note that in the weeks before her death, Marilyn told Dr. Greenson that she wished to terminate therapy with him. Marilyn became good friends with Pat Kennedy Lawford, whose husband, Peter Lawford, was friends with Frank Sinatra. Pat Kennedy was, of course, Robert and Jack Kennedy's sister. Marilyn was first introduced to Jack in 1960 backstage at a campaign speech he was giving. The two were observed flirting openly. It was later, when Jack was president, that the two allegedly had a weekend fling at Bing Crosby's house in Palm Springs. Despite claims of wiretaps and unsourced FBI reports, this is the only time eyewitnesses claimed to have seen the two icons together. There is not even proof they slept together that weekend. Although Marilyn's dear friend Ralph Roberts claimed she told him, quote, very specifically that they were together that weekend, and that was it as the only time. What surrounds the supposed affair is mostly unprovable speculation. It was rumored that after this, Marilyn became obsessed with the Kennedys. She would take any opportunity to see them or be near them. At some point, she and Bobby began a friendship. It is claimed that he was dispatched by his brother, Jack, to tell Marilyn to stop calling the White House. Whatever the impetus, Bobby and Marilyn were definitely, at the very least, friends. She would call him and he would listen to her problems. This was substantiated by many of Bobby's friends. Marilyn was very big into her telephone conversations and would often stay on the phone all day or all night calling various friends. It has never been proven that Marilyn and Bobby had a sexual affair. Marilyn was not only followed by the FBI, but at one point, Frank Sinatra and Joe DiMaggio hired private investigators to follow her as well, something that resulted in what was called the Wrong Door Raid, an incident where Sinatra and DiMaggio broke down the door to someone's apartment, believing Marilyn was in there with another man. This incident caused an embarrassed Sinatra to have to testify about it in open court. The FBI began tracking Marilyn when she took up with Arthur Miller, who was a suspected communist. And then later, her proximity to the Kennedy family also made her an ideal target. Marilyn would often tell people she was being followed and her phone was tapped, but they rarely believed her, instead thinking that this was a paranoid manifestation of some kind of mental illness. The official story goes as follows. Marilyn was fired from her most current film, Something's Got to Give, co-starring Dean Martin and directed by George Cukor, just days after her 36th birthday for her erratic behavior and for going to New York to perform in a Democratic Party fundraiser, which we know as the infamous Happy Birthday, Mr. President show. She was distraught and depressed. On August 4th, 1962, she retired to her room and called Joe DiMaggio Jr. and a few other friends. Eunice Murray did not live there, but was apparently staying over that night. The housekeeper noticed the light was on and the phone cord under the door when she went to bed. When she awoke at 2 a.m., the light was still on, so she knocked on the door and there was no answer. The door was locked. Eunice Murray called Dr. Greenson and he came over. He saw Marilyn unresponsive in bed through the bedroom window and broke in. At 4 a.m., they called the police, stating calmly that Marilyn Monroe was dead. The autopsy listed her death as a probable suicide via acute barbiturate poisoning. It was stated that in the days leading up to her death, she had been depressed, disheveled, not bathing, not combing her hair. This is the unofficial story. According to reliable witnesses, the events of August 4th went down quite differently. Marilyn had just been rehired on Something's Got to Give at a higher salary. She was happily decorating her new home. She had several visitors that day who reported seeing her outside working in her garden, looking and acting perfectly normal. At some point, Bobby Kennedy was seen going into Marilyn's house in the late afternoon or evening. Several neighbors witnessed this. The neighbors say he came and left and came and left again. Per Marilyn's handyman, who may or may not be reliable, Bobby sent he and Eunice Murray out of the house for a few hours. Something about the encounter with Bobby upset Marilyn. Dr. Ralph Greenson, who lived 2 blocks away, was called to the house when Eunice Murray returned and discovered a nearly hysterical Marilyn. It is unknown what happened at this time, but it is believed he gave Marilyn something to calm her down. He asked Eunice Murray to stay the night to keep an eye on her. That evening, Peter Lawford called Marilyn to ask her if she was coming to a dinner party at his and Pat's house. She demurred, which wasn't unusual. Sometimes she just didn't want to be social. According to the official story, she then said to Peter, "Say goodbye to Pat. Say goodbye to the president. Say goodbye to yourself, 'cause you're a nice guy." Marilyn then called Joe DiMaggio Jr., who said she was in high spirits and sounded just fine. She then called Dr. Ralph Greenson and told him how happy she was that DiMaggio Jr. had broken it off with a girlfriend Marilyn had not liked. Somewhere around this time, Peter Lawford tried to call Marilyn back, but the line was busy. So he called Marilyn's attorney, Mickey Rudin, and asked him to check on her. Mickey called the house at 9 p.m. and Eunice Murray answered. He requested she check on the star and she told him everything was fine. Eunice Murray went to bed. At 10 p.m., Marilyn's doctor, Hyman Engelberg's wife, recalls that he received a phone call at the Hollywood Bowl where they were attending a concert. Marilyn was in trouble. At this time, Dr. Greenson was also called. Both were at the house by midnight, where it was obvious Marilyn was dead. Still, the police were not called for several hours. Greenson did admit he called the studio before he called the police. Shortly after midnight, patrolman Lynn Franklin spotted a car speeding on Olympic Boulevard. He pulled it over to find Peter Lawford driving, a man he later identified as Ralph Greenson in the back seat, and none other than Bobby Kennedy in the front seat. By the way, Bobby's official story is that on the night of Marilyn Monroe's death, he was in San Francisco staying at a friend's ranch with his family. Franklin stated that Lawford told him he had to get Bobby to the Hilton to check out so he didn't miss his plane. Officer Franklin informed Lawford he had missed the exit, and he was also going 75 and a 25. to which Bobby allegedly replied, "You ass." The coroner's report stated, quote, "The toxicological analysis concluded that the cause of death was acute barbiturate poisoning. 8 milligrams of chloral hydrate, 4.5 milligrams of Nembutal, and 13 milligrams of phenobarbital were found in her liver. Empty bottles of these medicines were next to her bed." However, Dr. Noguchi, who performed the autopsy, said later in interviews he did not rule out other means of death, that it was a puzzle, an unsolved puzzle. It is interesting to note that Noguchi set aside the internal organs for further study, and that someone threw them out before this examination could take place. But here is where everything starts to go a little haywire. There are multiple stories to choose from. Bobby killed Marilyn because she was threatening to expose him in a press conference. The CIA hired Sam Giancana to kill Marilyn. Sam Giancana decided to kill Marilyn and frame Bobby for it. Dr. Greenson killed Marilyn either accidentally or on purpose. Marilyn was alive when they found her, and an ambulance was called, but she died before they made it to the hospital, so they turned around and brought her back home. An ambulance driver claims to have seen Greenson plunge a syringe full of Nembutal into Marilyn's heart, killing her. Private investigator Fred Otash claims he heard Bobby's henchmen killing Marilyn over wiretaps. What is interesting to note is years later in an interview, Eunice Murray would admit there was no lock on the door to Marilyn's room, and that she had been covering up the fact that Bobby Kennedy was at Marilyn's house that day. We can never be sure what truly happened. What we do know is this: Marilyn Monroe was a sensitive, kind, smart, savvy, fun, and ambitious woman whose talent and beauty has lingered with us like an exotic perfume long after she's left the room.